Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our Sherman's March to the Sea series, which was conducted at the Georgia Historical Society in February of 1996 in Savannah, Georgia. Previous lectures have introduced you to the Defender of Savannah, William Hardee, and the Commander of the Union Forces, William Tecumseh Sherman. Now I'd like to spend some time actually going through the mechanics of the March to the Sea and what did and what didn't happen, the fact and the fiction of this. Interestingly enough, in the early days with Blue and Gray, I didn't know a whole lot of people. I had a big library, though. Library was getting bigger, and I'd look around for different people and so forth and try to track them down. But sometimes people tracked me down. They were looking to see what was going on. Some people that weren't part of the rubber chicken meat and potatoes circuit of Civil War speakers had written good books, but had not yet found a mechanism for increasing their popularity or their visibility. In a lot of instances, they had published good books that weren't necessarily published by top-rate publishers, and so they found themselves having to go around and sell their own books. Our next speaker, Lee Kennett, kind of fell in between that, and it was interesting because Lee found me and found Blue and Gray. He had just written a book, which at the time I had not had an opportunity to read, and he said, "Hey, look, I see that you're doing a Sherman's March to the Sea. I'm the most current historian on the march there. I've just put out a book and so forth on this, and I'd really be very honored if you'd have me present at your conference." And I said, "Well, I haven't seen your book yet." At that time, I was living on a real shoestring budget. He says, "I'll send it to you." Well, what do you do? I mean, guy sends you a book, you got to read it. I did, and I found it where it was a wonderful book. It was exactly what he presented it to be, and it was something that I found to be very objective and very readable. And I commend it to you. I think it's long out of print, so you may have to look for it on a secondary market like at El Libris or others like that. But it certainly was a fine book, and with it, starting from the beginning of the campaign and running through Savannah, um, it was a no-brainer. So I said, "Of course, come on down, please speak to me." And I found him to be a delightful gentleman and a well-spoken man, and I think you'll find that as well. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Lee Kennett's presentation of the March to the Sea. Incidentally, Lee is another one of those wonderful historians who has since gone to his reward. So please enjoy part of his legacy. Okay, as hard as I try to set a good schedule, I invariably put myself a little bit behind. We're just a couple minutes behind, so I'm going to ask your indulgence. His lack of manners, and found out shortly after I had tried to make alternate arrangements. Dr. Kennett wrote me a letter, and he said, "I see you're going to have a seminar on Sherman's March to the Sea. I'm intimately interested in it. Please send me information." I said, "You wouldn't believe it." Then I found out that he was just 50 miles down the road. I'm in Danville, and he has retired to Georgia, or to right around Greensboro, North Carolina. And so after a short couple of chats, he graciously agreed to join the program, and we configured this program so that we could have the 6 presentations today. To understand even more about Dr. Kennett, he has a well-rounded education. He's a graduate of University of North Carolina, the University of Mississippi, and the University of Virginia for successive programs. So he certainly has a broad base of experience. He is also the author of 10 different books, of which this is his first endeavor in the Civil War, and my comment to him is, "Why did you wait so long?" It's so good. He is currently working on another study right now, a study of the Battle of Gettysburg, which I'm certainly looking forward to. And we're absolutely delighted to have him here. He's down here. His wife, Anna Marie, will join us later today, and will be with us, I assume, for dinner tomorrow night. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Lee Kennett.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we weren't able to make the connections earlier, but the moral of all that is, if you publish a book, don't publish it with HarperCollins. They won't forward your reader's mail. I want to talk about an aspect of the story, which I had considerable interest when I was preparing the book, and that is, what is it like to be on the receiving end of this celebrated invasion? So I might begin by saying a little something about the people of Georgia in 1864, the people who were on the receiving end. You've been up to Macon, you've seen the country, but imagine that the same countryside with about 1/6 of the inhabitants it currently has. It was a population that was very sparsely scattered throughout the state. That was the largest state east of the Mississippi, and about 1 million population. The roads were very few. And of course, there was not a single paved road in the entire state. Cities were small. Savannah was the largest city in Georgia in 1860. Well, in 1860, we know from the census figures. After that, for the wartime period, you can only guess. But only Savannah had over 20,000 population. Macon in 1860 was about 3,000 or 4,000 people. That's all. So it's a sparse, scattered population that has difficulty keeping track of what is going on. Newspapers are few and becoming fewer as the paper supplies diminish. Telegraph served only a few communities, and what most people heard, they heard by way of mouth. And what they heard about the Yankees, they heard by way of mouth, and none of it, of course, was good. And this was to have a somewhat tragic consequence in their preparation for the arrival of the Yankees. Another fact to be pointed out is that Georgia's government and Confederate government did really nothing to prepare people for being invaded by an enemy army. We like to talk, the current fad these days is to downsize government. Georgia's government in 1864 was sized down about as far as you could take it. State capital was, Milledgeville was a village. That's what the Union soldiers called it. They couldn't believe a state capital could be that small. There was the governor's mansion, There was the state capitol, which in fact was where the legislature met. They built an asylum for the insane, and they built a prison. That was it. That's it. There are no administrative buildings. There is no education department because there's no public education system. There's no roads and works department because there are only roads to take care of. That's Tone County. All these things are handed to the local government, such as it was. The result is that when a crisis emerges of unprecedented proportions, as it did for Georgia, beginning about 1863-4, the government is simply unequipped to do it, has never had the powers, hasn't exercised such powers. The governor at the period, Joe Brown, was an extraordinarily able man, no doubt about that. And he had the following of a vast mass of the population, immensely popular, particularly among the common people, somewhat less among the so-called aristocrats. But even he could only do so much. And the state was unprepared for what was about to happen. If some government agency had just gotten out a pamphlet to be handed out through Central and South Georgia, what to do if the Yankees show up. But they did just the opposite. They did the worst thing. They pretended that the Yankees would never arrive, that this was unspeakable, and at the same time they portrayed them as people who committed unspeakable acts. So the population was terrified, to a large extent, by what would happen when the Yankees appeared. And the press followed this same routine. We like to think that in the 1860s, the subject of rape, for example, as a crime, was not much discussed. It hadn't been, but it was discussed at this point. If there was a rape, it figured in the Georgia press in 1864. And the opinion, therefore, formed among the population of the way Yankees would behave when they arrived was of the worst. And the stage was set, I suppose, for unleashing a catastrophe on people totally or largely unprepared for what was coming their way. If there'd been a Georgia civil defense organization, they would have fared a lot better. The government's reaction, we've already had that mentioned, suggested that you have a scorched earth policy. It was not possible to face Sherman with traditional or professional military forces. They simply weren't there. They were in Tennessee with General Hood. When the invasion, the march became clear, about the 18th or 19th of November, Governor Brown had a great idea. He would mobilize the entire male population of Georgia. He got the legislature to vote, what we call a levée en masse. They mobilized everybody. All the men were immediately to go to the nearest train station, and the trains were to give them free transportation. If any of the conductors or the president of the line refused, they'd be put in the army and sent to the front. And these men were to go to concentration points where they would be trained, armed, and the whole population would stop Sherman. Nothing happened. The order was voted, the law was voted, but there is no evidence that it had any practical effect anywhere. After the invasion, I found Governor Brown sending out officers to arrest people who didn't show up in various counties, and I suspect the failure to show up was almost universal. It was a dead letter, partly because it made no sense. Sherman is marching on your home. The first thing you do is leave your wife and children and jump on the nearest train. Or do that. I also suspect that the news of this law was very imperfectly disseminated. This is a time of increasing confusion. Sherman's cavalry is chopping down the telegraph lines every time they find one. The wildest rumors are circulating. Georgia's about to be cut in half, in fact. And I suspect that most people didn't even know of this famous mobilization order. Nor probably did most people know that the Confederate Congress had called them to assail personally The enemy on front, flank, and rear burn the bridges, destroy all foodstuffs in the enemy's path. They didn't do it. They probably didn't know they were ordered to do it, but they would not have done it anyway. I'm convinced. If you burn the bridge down here on the Ogeechee, that means that Sherman's army can't cross. Well, wait a minute. If Sherman's army can't cross, it's going to stay here with us. Worse, it's going to disintegrate into roving bands of hungry men who are armed, and it's bad enough when they're distant. No acts of sabotage, with one exception that I know of, that were committed to try to stop Sherman's movement. It could have been stopped. Had Wheeler and the southern population, the Georgia population, systematically destroyed everything. The soldiers had to eat. And they were eating exclusively off the land. They had to move across creeks and so forth. They had to find their way. It's conceivable that if they kept food and horses, draft animals, out of the reach of Sherman's army, the army would never make it. That's the only way. Sherman left Atlanta with draft animals in a terrible state. He had something between 2,500 and 3,000 wheeled vehicles for him. That was a big possibility to start. It would require extraordinary sacrifice, massive sacrifice on the part of an alert and well-informed population. We haven't got that in Georgia in 1864. The other way Sherman could have been stopped, there was one other force that could have stopped him. I couldn't help but speculate on this when I was doing my research. The weather, nature. I don't know how familiar you are with Georgia's topography, but the state beyond the fall line, north of the fall line, an awful lot of red clay. And all the roads were red clay in 1864. And Georgia can have, even South Georgia, snowstorms, torrential rains, severe freezing. Sherman's army ran into bad weather beginning about the 18th of November. Continued on for several days, and the army slowed down. They simply could not get by, get through the roads. Were abandoning equipment, they were abandoning horses and wagons, and had it continued, there would have been very, very severe difficulties. But the weather cleared up about the 21st of November. The sun came out. It was terribly cold. Water froze in the canteens, but from that point on, they had a clear road all the way into Savannah. The Confederates couldn't put any obstacles in front of them, and nature did not put any further obstacles in front of them. So the march was going to take place, and it would be carried out essentially unimpeded. If you lived in the path of this approaching mass, what would it be like? What was your reaction when the Bluecoats first showed up on your front steps? Well, for about the first 50 miles outside of Atlanta, the reaction was absolutely flabbergasted, shocked. They were said like Aunt Pittypat, where did they come from? How did they get here? Because no advance word reached these people for a distance of about 50 miles out. And for the Northern soldiers, they were surprised too. These were the first towns they entered where there were actually people in the streets and walking on the sidewalks. Towns usually been evacuated, empty. But that only lasted for about 2 or 3 days. The word began to spread. Wheeler got in position where he could carry the word, his men eventually. And you had some time to prepare before these people arrived. The word spread. So what do you do to prepare? The first decision and the fundamental decision you have to make is, do you stay or do you clear out? And here the Georgians made a terrible mistake in many cases. In 2 out of 3, maybe 3 out of 4 instances, they simply fled their homes. Where they went in swamps, they carried some food, they didn't carry food, they went to see Aunt Sarah, anywhere, but they fled. And as has been pointed out, soldiers arrive at an empty house, open house, they take what they want. The argument in the soldiers' mind was that these people ran off. That means they're really, really red-hot rebels, and they know they'll be in trouble if they caught. So they ran. So, in fact, these people are really enemies. So they take anything they want. Had they stayed, and Northern officers acknowledged this, they simply stayed in the spot. Sure, they'd lost everything. It wasn't nailed down, but their houses would have come through attacked, and they'd have been. But they took off. So terrible were the rumors that spread, and so fearful were they. We suspect that Ross resolved to stay. And then when he saw the Joneses going down the road, and then the McPhersons right after them, they started throwing things in bags and took off. We suspect that's the case. In any event, most of the population got out of the way, or tried to. But whether you leave or whether you go, you've got to try to make some effort to dispose of your property. There's some preparation made in this respect. What do you do with valuables? Jewelry, silver. Well, if it wasn't too bulky, women hid jewels and watches and things of that nature in their own clothing. A significant action, in my opinion, because it implies a certain assumption that the women make on the part of the Northern soldiers who want to come to see them. Then the livestock can be driven off, usually pinned somewhere in a swamp, not too terribly far away. But much that they have is too bulky to transport very far and too heavy to carry, and it is buried. And had they gotten out that little civil defense manual, it would have said things like, don't bury anything near the house. Don't lower your silver into the well. That's the first place they look. But they didn't have that pamphlet, and they buried and they lowered things into the well. These are beginners hiding things from people who are professionals at finding. And it's the professionals who win. Although sometimes you run across interesting little episodes. Some Northern soldiers stopped to rest by the side of the road, took a halt there in the march, and they were lying around, looking around, and at some distance was a house with 3 or 4 women sitting on the front porch. And the soldiers saw that there was a patch of freshly turned earth nearby. And it wasn't long before they were digging, and as they saw, the women in the house became more agitated on the porch, so this encouraged them to dig further, and finally at about 4 feet they brought up the body of a recently deceased spaniel dog. And one of the soldiers felt they'd had a trick played on him, so he went over there to talk to the ladies. Was chatting about this, and they said, well, we're sorry, but you're the 4th crowd of soldiers to dig that dog up this morning. An interesting question if you own slaves and you're hiding your possessions. Do you have them help you? Here, the question of how much you trust your slaves comes into question. And a great many cases we have where the fellow just didn't quite trust them. He said, boys, we're going to put a fence out this morning, and he had them dig holes periodically where they were going to set the fence posts. And then he said, well, it's time for lunch, you all can get your lunch. I'll stay here and set the posts. He set the posts, but under each he put some gold coins. He was distributing his fortune down there. And when they came back, they continued with the fence and used them for it. If he did reveal to the slaves, or did confide to them, or they took part in the burial process, he could later have a very unpleasant surprise. Well, what was it like when those blue coats appeared? Well, there was wasn't any manual to tell you if the Yankees start up your porch, up the steps, don't shout out, "What do you bluebellies want here?" But that didn't have to be done. Actually, the reception was usually fairly formal, but there were usually attempts obviously on the women's part to avoid any scene. There are two different scenarios of encounter, depending upon whether you lived in a house on the main road where the bulk of one of Sherman's columns was passing, or if you lived away from the road and you were visited not by 15,000 marching men, but by maybe 5 or 10. And there the rules of engagement were different. If you lived on the road, you could expect the soldiers to continually pour into your yard, to go first for the well. There were some wells along the roadside that were drained dry, emptied, as the soldiers simply kept bailing up water. Then you could see them prowling around, looking in the outbuildings and so forth. And anything that was not nailed down, and some things that were, could depart with it. You had the good sense to stay in the house. This is generally the pattern. Nobody tried to protect their outbuildings. And Sherman told the family on the road to Savannah, he said, anything you really value, move in your house. They've got a chance to hold on to it. That from the leader himself turned out to be good advice. At the main house, they would come up and knock, and if you didn't answer, they'd go ahead and try the door. And if the door was locked, there's a good chance they'd knock it down. When you had a procession of these endless visits, the women generally learned to just stay out front on the porch, show them the house is occupied, and if you want to go in, you've got to get by me. Not that you can give up anything like physical defense. But at the same time, if you stayed outside, when officers rode by, particularly somebody who was wearing stars, you could invite him to come in and rest or have a glass of lemonade or whatever you could offer. And when the general was in the house, no other soldiers would come in. He was safe. And there were people who arranged to have safeguard. A soldier stationed at your front gate, that meant the rest of you stay out. There was a crowd of officers that traveled with General Howard that had put together a musical ensemble. They liked to get together and sing. And whenever that corps arrived in a particular spot, they fanned out and began looking for a house with a piano. And they weren't very hesitant to get themselves invited, just invite themselves in. Swamped by 15 Union officers who were going to bang on her piano all evening and on maybe in the morning hours and sing. That's an inconvenience, but it's a lot worse if it's an endless procession of troops passing through your house. And so if you had a piano and you were in the path of General Howard's army, you had a chance there for an additional safeguard. Then the engagement, the meeting off the line of march, is usually at an isolated farmhouse. And I mean isolated. How many of us live in such a distance from our neighbors that at night we cannot see their lights burning? That was probably the majority of cases at church. When the sun went down, you felt awful. There was nobody within hailing distance, nobody would telephone to call anybody, isolated. And here you would have the foragers, or the foragers and the rummagers, or the rummagers and the bummers. Difficult to distinguish among these people. 2, 3, 5, 10, 15, usually not more than 15. And they came for specific purposes. They wanted food because they had to take that back to the men in their regiment or company so that they would have something to eat. And they also wanted horses, mules, they needed transport. The Army was constantly renewing its draft animals as it went south. And This, of course, all of these things were usually outside. There was a smokehouse where the meat was and so forth. There was a separate kitchen where food was kept. But in the main house, many of the houses, the main house, they didn't have any business coming in there, but they always had a good excuse. Ladies, we think you've got some Red soldiers hiding with you. Oh, no. Well, we've got to come in and check. And though the woman might bar the door physically, she didn't persist when they stepped forward. It was absolutely essential to avoid any physical contact, as you can imagine. So she had to give way as they poured into her house. It was almost always a woman who answered the door. The Union troops noticed that they saw almost no men. And there were plenty of men in the Georgia countryside that fall. Men who were exempted from military service, soldiers who were back home on leave, recuperating from wounds, fellows hiding out because the provost marshal was looking for them. They were on the deserters list. Fellows hiding out from the conscription officer that hadn't even been caught the first time, and they planned to knock them. There's no doubt that there were thousands of men concealed for the most part in the countryside of Georgia. And northern troops got the impression that there were no men. Just didn't see any. There probably is a man associated with household, but he is not there. He is probably 300, 400, 500 yards away with the livestock carefully hidden in a grove of trees or something. Why this repetitious pattern which occurs over and over again, even from the southern side, you see. Mama got us ready to meet the Yankees, and Papa, he went out the back door and he went on down into the woods. Why that scenario? Because despite the stories that one heard, the family that stayed reached the conclusion that the danger of physical violence to the woman was minimal, and they were right. The danger of physical violence to the man who stayed was considerable, and once again they were right. There are enough cases recounted on both sides of where a man was strung up, hanged until just before he goes unconscious, and then lowered down and then said, "Now, where did you say you hid your jewelry?" And 2 or 3 times with that stunt, and you'll probably tell. Or sometimes they would string up slaves for that purpose. Everybody didn't do this, but it would sometimes be done to men. It was never done to women. At least there's no record of it that I was able to find. And this is the basic assumption they made. And it must have been a difficult thing to write. And it must have been difficult for the men to abandon. But it seems to have been the sound and right decision. But the woman has other ways to turn from her this danger. First of all, she will go to the door dressed as a widow. Well, husband may still be down there timing, but she is, for intensive purposes, today a widow. And she will receive the men calmly, politely, with a certain distance. Her children are with her. An added element of appeal here is the mother of the children. And they've been schooled how to behave, and eyes are big as saucers, but they look very serious and well behaved. Many of these children looked fat because they'd heard that the Yankees would burn, if they burned the house, they would give you a chance to get a thing. So the woman and her children both might be wearing several dresses and several petticoats, things like that. One woman remembered with a great deal of embarrassment that she was a child, 8 or 9, and her mother had literally turned her into a stuffed dummy. And one of the northern soldiers bent down to her and said, are all Southern girls as plump as you are? She hadn't got over the mortification of that 60 years later. The woman will be closely quizzed about livestock, foodstuffs. And her quickest way out is to say, well, the Confederates are already here, they took it all. Or, well, you're the second or third party that's been here, they cleaned me out. But if the foraging party knows their business, they've checked for tracks around the house before they arrive. And they know where there's been a lot of movement and stock driven and so forth. It's at this point that a slave might well step forth and say, the horses are hidden down in the swamp, and all the cured meat is hidden under the haystack behind the barn. To the shock, utter shock of the mistress, he's given the game away. And that slave then will depart with the invaders. He won't stay. But we know that they often picked on the slave. While they're quizzing the lady of the house, some of them be out there in the yard and, come on now, you know where these stuff are. And they will sometimes string a slave up and give him a talk. One northern officer whose specialty was rounding up horses to replenish the supply of Sherman told me that he rode quite a distance, more than 10 miles in either direction, sometimes spend the night out there, but collecting horses. He said he stopped at one farm where he could tell from the layout of the barns and everything that this fellow had a lot of livestock, a lot of horses. You could tell by the manure, by the tracks and so forth. They're all gone. And he was convinced they were around there somewhere, so he talked this old black slave, and he said, come on, you know where they're hidden. Why don't you just tell me? I'm not going to do anything, harm you or anything like that. Why don't you just tell me? And the slave told him, no, I'm not going to tell you. He said, I'm too old to go with you, and I'm too young to stay here and be murdered. And the man left with all horses. The entrance of the soldiers into the house leads, inevitably, in most cases, to a search. Now, there are not going to be any rebel soldiers hiding in the bottom drawer of the bureau, but they feel they have to look there anyway. And it is very often this entrance turns into a kind of a scavenger hunt. And the woman must hold her tongue if she possibly can. One northern soldier said they were always very polite to us until we started going through their things. And she said, then I've heard women call us things I wouldn't dare repeat. I know where they learned those words. And this may go on, but not for long. Because the foraging party is not going to linger very long. They are in enemy country. Wheeler is out there, they know that, and they know that there is a possibility that they will be attacked by groups of Southern civilians. There's a good chance that the woman of the house, when she sees them coming, has sent somebody with word, the Yankees are here. And the response may be at the arrival of Wheeler's cavalry or some other unit that's available. These fellows may have a fight on their hands, and they're not ever very many of them. So they tend to not linger. And if the woman of the house is extremely cordial, well, listen, can I fix you a cup of tea? Or, wait a minute, I'll have some sandwiches made. They know to get out of there fast. Because if they're caught, they'll be executed. Stuff. It usually turned into a butchery if they caught northern troops in southern homes. The normal rules of war didn't seem to apply. What happened if you were caught? Well, there was one poor fellow who was searching inside a house, and the 4 or 5 others were outside, and all of a sudden they heard the thunder of hoofbeats, and there was the Confederate cavalry arriving. And he could see the other guys bolt on the horses and fly away, and he just jumped under the bed. There was a young woman in the house and her mother. They were standing there watching him as he roamed through the house picking things up. And he went under the bed. And he heard this great clamor at the front door and all these footsteps, stomping of Southern cavalry horsemen's boots, and from under that he could see their muddy boots come within the 10 to 15 inches of his face. And he heard one say, any Yankees left in here? And the young woman said, no, they're all gone. And they didn't linger. He took off, and he came crawling out of that bed, and he didn't linger. And he said, if this were a novel, I would have gone back and married that Southern girl. But he said, I love that little liar to this very day. Sometimes, if the family had an older man, and they hadn't been able to get him out of the way, he would shoot if he had to. Find that Grandpa has to be gotten rid of because he has sworn any bluebelly touches anything he walks in, he's going to kill him. And here and there, they weren't able to get Grandpa out of the way, and he did shoot or wound or kill somebody, and at that point the house is burned. That was part of the rules of the any resistance to the structure is destroyed. But sometimes the people at home actually had more firepower than the foragers. Not often. But I know of one case in which 2 foragers were killed. And then, having done them in, they had this awful question, what do we do with them? Don't bury it. Because anything over it is turned earth, more Yankees will come and they'll be turning out over, and we're really going to be in a serious situation. They couldn't know what to do with them, and finally they came up with an ingenious solution. They took both bodies and they baled each dead body inside a bale of cotton. And set those 2 bales over on the side with a tag on them, do not sell. And those bales of cotton stayed there for many years. Then the tag fell off. Maybe another generation, another owner inherited that warehouse full of cotton. And the bales were sold, shipped to Europe, and they're open. Surprise. But that was not a story told for many years after. So I said the assumption that violence to the women would not occur was a wise one. And that many people fled because they feared just that horrible material. But in fact, I have found, and those who researched it before me have found almost no record, a handful of cases. Joseph Gladhar looked at court-martial records. Well, I've got to have an officer aware of that and a formal charge, and a lot of this stuff went undetected. Certainly in the Union ranks. But a lot of Southern newspapers published these episodes when they occurred. I know of one rather well-known assault that occurred in Milledgeville. That made the rounds. Everybody knew about that. Talk about and so forth. Just doesn't occur. Sometimes women are frisked. But the fact that they would actually hide jewelry on their persons, and therefore give the Yankees an additional reason to frisk, or whatever they plan to do, the fact that we do that seems significant to me. They just don't find it. We don't find it. It's one interesting case, hilarious case, I guess, where a woman was being questioned by the Northern troopers, and she had 2 or 3 of her female slaves were there with her, and they were in a terrible state of anxiety. And they got so agitated that one of the cavalrymen there shouted over and said, "You all close up." Give military order. But they thought he said clothes as like clothes you wear. And they immediately lifted their skirts. And when they did that, the lady there said, "Wait a minute, I think I have a watch here." And which she produced, and which they allowed her to keep. Interesting enough, if the anecdote that comes down to us is accurate. Well, this then was what it seems to have looked like. They didn't know what to do, but in the end they came out, I think, fairly well when they took a chance with the Yankees, oddly enough, as it turns out. Do you have time for me to take a few questions?
Absolutely, please.
All right. I have one problem with questions. Well, two. One is I don't often know the answer sometimes. The other problem is that I don't hear very well. And this is the result of long and intimate association with a 3-inch naval cannon. So if you have a question, if you would speak up and, well, talk the way you talk to people who are hard of hearing and feeble of mind. Slowly. All right, does anyone have a question or an observation to that matter? Yes, sir.
And you mentioned in the last paragraph that you're right up here, the march of historical perspective in folklore and myth. Could you just say a few words about that?
I could, although that subject's been covered very ably by those who preceded me. As time
From
goes
this
on,
same perspective that you did speak.
pretty much the march got worse in the southern version and almost like a schoolboy prank in the northern version. It's possible to study the evolution of these myths, and I have not done a profound study of them, but history changes, and it's usually historians who change it, or myth makers. Yes, sir.
The percentage of slaves that went with the Union Army or went somewhere as opposed to those who stuck around and stayed on the homestead. Do you have a feel for that relationship?
There's some figures, and I can't give any specific numbers. Each corps commander tried to estimate how many slaves followed his column as far as Savannah, but they came and went all the time. My personal feeling is that probably the majority of the slaves stayed pretty much put. And of course, it's usually the younger and the more adventuresome who go, but not always. Professor Glathar tends to see a larger number following and to see them well treated and welcomed. And I see a smaller number and not always very cordial reception. There are objects of curiosity more often than of sympathy, to my mind, the way I read the records. Yes, sir.
I may have missed the question, but you talked about the treatment of the women. Was there a difference for the treatment of the slaves? Rumors tend to persist that they were treated worse by the Union soldiers, say, than a white woman would have been treated.
Probably so. There we have almost no references, but we do have some references that on the march, certain officers and even men carried women slaves with them. And one memoir writer speaks of dark houris inside the carriages and inside the wagons. But suspect it would be the case. Yeah, they worked through the platform. Yes, sir.
If you were on the main line of marching, how long would it take Sherman to get through?
Oh, it's hard to say. Probably most of the day. Well, it depends on how much the army can buy. Theoretically, it follows 4 routes. So sometimes you had 2 corps packed on the same road, and how much wheel traffic there was, and how rapidly they were moving. If there was a bridge out, they'd have to stop for that, or resisting somewhere, a few shots fired. But you could watch them most of the day. Those who watched them go by were enormously impressed with the number. I had no idea there were this many Yankees in the world. They were only saw a fourth of us, of course. Yes, sir.
I might be able to add a little clarification to that. There's a quote from a lady who lived near Milledgeville, and she lived on one of the main roads, and she talked about that they knew they were coming for several days because they could see the dust in the distance. And she said the first to come were the cavalry. She said they passed an entire day. She said after that came the infantry, marching 4 abreast, and it took like 3 days for these columns of infantry to pass her house. Following that were the wagon trains, and it took a day for the wagon trains to follow. And then, she says, the how she put it, the worst and the most to be avoided were the bummers. And for about 2 days, they drifted by your house. So in essence, about a week for that particular column to pass her house.
Any other
Well, if
questions?
the bummers were that far behind, why couldn't Wheeler pick off a few of them or more of them?
No, the Northern soldiers themselves wondered why somebody didn't fire a shot. We're strung out on the road, you fire a shot anyway, you hit somebody, and we would have been forced to take to the ditches, send out a party. They would have stopped us. One shot would have stopped the column, but it doesn't occur. Yes,
The town of Fitzgerald, Georgia, where Union veterans after the Civil War gathered and bought a lot of property and set up are you aware of any anticipating any difficulties that they had from the native Georgia population?
I don't think so. That's the 90s we're talking about. That's 30 years later,
Yeah.
and even the old Confederates.
But hasn't the history by now made his march
Well, he probably
that
did.
much worse?
Probably not be well received by civilians in the countryside around there sometimes, but among the old vets, they always forget fastest the bad side. Anyone else?